U.S. flood latest updates. At least 10 dead in U.S. floods and heavy rain. The sound of rushing water fills the air, a deep and relentless roar that drowns out everything else. Trees bend under the pressure of the violent currents, and street signs barely peek out from the muddy waves. The rain hasn't stopped for days, pounding against rooftops, flooding streets, and turning once peaceful neighborhoods into disaster zones. People stand on their porches, staring helplessly as the water creeps closer, swallowing cars, homes, and everything in its path. Some try to wade through the waist-deep flood, clutching bags of whatever belongings they could grab in a hurry. Others wait on rooftops, hoping for rescue, shivering in the cold night air as the sound of helicopters circles above. Across the hardest-hit areas of Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia, the scenes are the same: devastation, panic, and heartbreak. This isn't just another storm. It's a catastrophe unfolding in real time, leaving families stranded and entire communities in ruins. Emergency sirens wail in the distance, and rescue boats cut through the murky floodwaters, searching for those who couldn't escape in time. In some places, the power is out, leaving people in darkness, their only light coming from the flashing red and blue of emergency vehicles. In Tennessee, the situation took a terrifying turn when the Obion River levee failed, sending an unstoppable surge of water through the small town of Reeves. It happened so quickly that many residents barely had time to react. Some ran, while others jumped into their cars, only to find the roads already submerged. Emily Carter, a mother of two, clutched her youngest child as she and her husband climbed onto the roof of their home, watching in disbelief as their car disappeared beneath the waves. It was like something out of a nightmare, she later recalled, her voice shaking. One minute, we thought we'd be okay, and the next, the water was everywhere. For many, there was no way out. In Kentucky, where the floodwaters were at their worst, Governor Andy Beshear confirmed at least 9 lives lost, one of them a child. A family of 3 was found trapped inside their vehicle, swept off the road by the raging current. In Pike County, another heartbreaking tragedy struck when a man attempting to escape on foot was pulled under by the force of the water. His family could do nothing but watch from the other side of the street, powerless to help. Rescue teams worked around the clock, but the conditions made their job nearly impossible. In some areas, the roads were completely destroyed, washed away, as if they had never existed. In others, mudslides blocked emergency routes, leaving people stranded with no way in or out. More than 1,000 high-water rescues had already taken place, but with each passing hour, the number of people still in danger grew. The National Weather Service called it a historic weather event, warning that rivers across the region were still rising and could crest in the coming days. That meant the flooding wasn't over yet. The worst might still be ahead. Meanwhile, a powerful winter storm loomed in the forecast, threatening to bring snow and freezing temperatures to areas still struggling to recover. In Virginia, the National Guard was deployed to assist with evacuations, but even they were struggling against the sheer force of nature. In the small town of Hurley, entire roads had turned into rivers, their currents so strong that even military vehicles had trouble making it through. "We've never seen anything like this," one rescue worker admitted. "It's like the land itself is fighting against us." And yet, in the midst of all the chaos, stories of survival and resilience emerged. In Dawson Springs, Kentucky, an elderly couple refused to leave their home, determined to wait out the storm. But when the floodwaters reached their doorstep, they had no choice. A neighbor with a small boat fought against the current to reach them, risking his own life to make sure they got to safety. In another part of the state, a group of strangers formed a human chain to pull a stranded family from their sinking car, holding on to each other with nothing but hope and sheer determination. The devastation wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. Families were separated, homes were destroyed, and for many, the life they had built was now gone. Shelters quickly filled with those who had nowhere else to go, their faces filled with exhaustion and uncertainty. Some clung to their pets, the only thing they had left, while others stared at their phones, waiting for a call or message to tell them that their loved ones were safe. Governor Beshear spoke with a heavy heart, his voice filled with worry as he addressed the people of Kentucky. "We are in the middle of another disaster," he said, his words echoing the pain of the state. "This is going to take time. It's going to take strength, but we will rebuild." He announced the creation of the Team Kentucky Storm Relief Fund, urging people to help however they could. And just like after the devastating tornadoes and floods of the past, Kentuckians responded with generosity, offering donations, opening their homes, and doing whatever it took to support their neighbors. But even as the relief efforts ramped up, there was still so much unknown. The floodwaters hadn't fully receded. Entire towns remained cut off, and the death toll, already at 10, was expected to rise. Officials warned that some of the missing might never be found, their fates lost to the relentless current, and, with more rain in the forecast, the fear remained. Was the worst still to come? Somewhere, in the middle of all this destruction, a young boy sat on a cot in a crowded shelter, his wide eyes staring at the ceiling. His mother sat beside him, holding his hand, whispering words of reassurance. But outside, the rain continued to fall, tapping against the windows, like a reminder that the storm wasn't over yet. And that's where we are now, standing on the edge of uncertainty, waiting for what comes next. The flood has already taken so much, but will it take even more? What happens when the water finally recedes? Who will be left to pick up the pieces? Stay with us as we uncover the full impact of this historic disaster, share the stories of those affected, and bring you the latest updates from the ground. Because this isn't just a storm, it's a fight for survival, and it's far from over. The rain had finally stopped, but the damage was done. The floodwaters still raged through the streets, twisting through towns like an unstoppable force, leaving behind nothing but destruction. Cars were stacked on top of each other, some overturned, others crushed against buildings. Homes that had stood for generations were now piles of wood and debris, torn apart by the unforgiving current. The air was thick with the smell of mud and dampness, a constant reminder of what had happened. But even as the storm moved on, the nightmare was far from over. Rescue crews worked non-stop, pulling survivors from rooftops and stranded vehicles. Families huddled together in shelters, their faces tired and filled with fear. Some had lost everything: their homes, their possessions, their sense of safety. Others were still waiting for news, hoping that loved ones missing in the flood would be found alive. The worst part was the silence. The usual sounds of life: cars honking, children laughing, doors opening and closing, were replaced with a heavy, unsettling quiet, broken only by the distant hum of helicopters and the occasional cry of someone discovering what they had lost. In the small town of Rives, Tennessee, Emily Carter sat in a shelter, her arms wrapped around her 2 young children. Just days ago, they had been safe in their home, watching cartoons, eating dinner at the kitchen table. Now they had nothing but the clothes on their backs and the memories of what used to be. She kept replaying the moment the levee broke, the way the water rushed in, swallowing everything in its path. Her husband, Mark, had been outside trying to move their car to higher ground when the flood came. He had yelled for her to take the kids and run. That was the last time she saw him. Now, she was stuck in this shelter, waiting, praying that he had made it out alive. In Kentucky, where the flood had been the most brutal, emergency responders continued their search. Governor Andy Beshear's voice had been somber in his latest update. More bodies had been found, bringing the death toll even higher. Some were discovered inside their cars, unable to escape when the water hit. Others had been swept away, their bodies found miles from where they were last seen. There were stories of heartbreak everywhere. An elderly couple who had held hands as the water filled their home. A father who had managed to push his son onto a rescue boat before being taken by the current himself. In Pike County, a group of volunteers worked to clear debris from the roads. Among them was Jake Thompson, a firefighter who had spent the last 48 hours searching for survivors. He had seen more loss than he could process. Homes turned to rubble, people trapped with nowhere to go, families torn apart in an instant. But the worst moment had come the night before, when he and his team found the body of a young girl, no older than 7. She had been clutching a stuffed animal, her tiny fingers still gripping it tightly. Jake had to look away, swallowing the lump in his throat. He had seen tragedy before, but this was different. This was something that would stay with him forever. In Virginia, the National Guard worked to get supplies to stranded communities. Roads had been wiped out by mudslides, leaving entire towns cut off. In some places, people had been without power for days, surviving on whatever food and water they had left. In Hurley, an elderly woman named Martha Reynolds refused to leave her home, even as the floodwaters crept closer. "This is my home," she told the rescue team when they arrived. "I've lived here my whole life. I won't leave it behind." But as the water rose higher, she realized she had no choice. She packed a small bag with photos and a few personal items, then stepped onto the rescue boat with tears in her eyes. The flood wasn't just a disaster. It was a test of survival, of resilience, of human strength. Some people clung to hope, believing that they could rebuild, that they would find a way forward. Others felt nothing but despair, unable to see how life could ever go back to normal. The destruction wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The loss of a home was more than just losing a place to live. It was losing memories, losing stability, losing a part of yourself. Even as rescue efforts continued, a new threat loomed on the horizon. A winter storm was on the way, bringing snow and freezing temperatures. For those who had lost everything, this was the worst possible news. Shelters were already overcrowded, and now people would have to brace for the cold with no home, no heat, no way to protect themselves. Officials urged residents to stay indoors. But for many, there was no indoors left to go to. As night fell, the floodwaters remained high, and the search for the missing continued. Families sat in shelters, staring at their phones, hoping for messages that never came. Rescue workers pushed forward, knowing that every second counted, and somewhere, beneath the dark, churning water, the full story of this disaster remained hidden, waiting to be uncovered. The storm may have passed, but the nightmare was far from over. What would morning bring? Would the water finally begin to recede, or would more lives be lost in the cold, relentless night? No one knew for sure. All they could do was wait and hope that when the sun rose, it wouldn't bring more tragedy with it. The night stretched on, cold and unrelenting. The floodwaters, though no longer rising, refused to recede fast enough. Entire towns remained underwater, their streets transformed into rivers. The search for survivors had become a race against time. In the shelters, people tried to sleep, but the fear of what tomorrow would bring made it impossible. Emily Carter sat by the shelter's entrance, staring at the door, hoping for a miracle. Every time someone walked in, she braced herself, waiting to hear news of her husband. Hours passed, and the weight of uncertainty settled deep in her chest. Then, just as she was about to close her eyes in exhaustion, she heard her name. She turned quickly, and there he was, Mark, covered in mud, his clothes soaked, but alive. A sob broke from her throat as she ran to him, their children crying as they wrapped their arms around him. He had been stranded on a rooftop for nearly a day before rescuers found him. Somehow, he had made it back to them. In Pike County, Jake Thompson and his team worked through the early morning hours. The water had begun to pull back, revealing the true scale of the devastation. Houses that once stood proudly were now piles of shattered wood. Cars, coated in thick layers of mud, were abandoned on roads that no longer existed. He had seen disasters before, but nothing like this. As he walked through what used to be a neighborhood, he spotted movement in the wreckage of a collapsed home. His heart pounded as he rushed forward, calling for his team. Underneath a broken section of the roof, a hand emerged, small, shaking. A little boy, barely 6 years old, was trapped in the debris. His eyes were wide with fear, his face streaked with dirt and dried tears. Jake dropped to his knees, speaking softly, reassuring the child that he was safe now. Within minutes, they pulled him out, wrapping him in a blanket. His parents were still missing, but at least he was alive. It was a small victory, but in moments like this, small victories meant everything. Across Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia, the stories of survival and loss continued to unfold. Some families were reunited, while others were left mourning loved ones, lost to the unforgiving waters. Volunteers arrived from neighboring states, bringing food, blankets, and supplies. The sense of community grew stronger, even in the face of such heartbreak. As the sun rose, revealing the destruction in full daylight, the reality of what lay ahead settled in. Rebuilding wouldn't happen overnight. It would take months, maybe years, to restore what was lost. But even in the wreckage, there was hope. People held on to each other, offering comfort where they could. The flood had taken so much, but it hadn't taken their determination to rise again. Governor Andy Beshear stood before the press, his voice steady despite the weight of the tragedy. He spoke of the lives lost, the families displaced, the long road to recovery, but he also spoke of the strength of the people, of their resilience. "We've been through this before," he said, "and we'll get through it again, together." In the days that followed, as the waters finally receded, people returned to what was left of their homes. Some found nothing but ruins. Others managed to salvage pieces of their past. Cleanup efforts began immediately, but it was clear that life wouldn't return to normal anytime soon. The scars of this disaster would remain, not just in the landscape, but in the hearts of those who lived through it. For Emily Carter, holding her children close, as they stood outside what used to be their home, the future was uncertain. But as she looked at Mark, at the people working together to rebuild, she knew one thing for sure: they would move forward, one step at a time. The flood had tested them all. It had taken, destroyed, and left a deep wound in the heart of their communities. But it hadn't broken them. And as they faced the long road ahead, they did so with hope, with strength, and with the unwavering belief that no matter how dark the storm, the light always returns.